Hello everyone, my name is Jillian Best. I am very happy to be here and I'm actually excited to tell you my story about my transplant journey. Just over 5 years ago, my life was saved. Without a liver transplant, I wouldn't be here today.
Jill, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I live in London, Ontario with my husband Zach and my two pugs, Frankie and Beans. And I run a hair salon called Best Hair Day in my home. And I'm absolutely addicted to swimming.
How and when did you first learn you might need a liver transplant?
When I was a teenager, my mom was really sick. I was about 15 years old. Our family had been affected by HHT. It stands for hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. And this disease leads to malformed blood vessels in multiple organs of the body. And in my mom's case, it affected her liver. And we almost lost my mom at that time, but she's a very strong lady. And in 2004, she had a life-saving liver transplant. So because this disease is hereditary, the rest of the family was tested shortly after mom's transplant. And we found that both my sister and I had the gene. And at that point, we realized that it was possible we might be affected in the same way that mom was. And due to the nature of this disease, we weren't expecting to become ill or need a transplant if that were to happen, though, until we were older.
So when was it that you started experiencing the symptoms from HHT?
Fast forward about 7 years from when my mom had her transplant. I was in my early 20s. I was working downtown London as a hairstylist, and I was also into running and training for half marathons. So when all was going well and I was feeling good, I started to feel pain in my abdomen, and I started feeling it every day after eating and even while I was resting. So over the next 6 months to a year, the pain progressively got worse, and one night while I was out with my husband, my now husband Zach, and some friends, I ended up in emergency with incredible pain, and I had to stop working. I was in too much pain to do anything.
And what happened next?
So my parents joined me at the hospital that night while we waited on results from an abdominal ultrasound. And the ultrasound revealed an issue with my liver. And we were told that at that time that it looked abnormal. And I just remember mom and I looking at each other and kind of realizing, like, oh no. So soon after this evening, I went to stay at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and this is where our family HHT specialist was. So I had a slew of tests done. I had an MRI, CT scans, and blood work, and they discovered innumerable amounts of telangiectasia on my liver, throughout my liver, and it was causing shunting, or also known as abnormal blood flow to my liver. And soon after, I was experiencing seizures, and I even spent 10 days in a coma.
So at this point, you're in your early 20s and you had early stages of liver failure. What did your specialist recommend to do at this point?
Well, I was only like 23 years old, and she thought that if we could avoid transplant while I was young, that would be best.
And what kind of treatment did she recommend then?
So there was this injectable drug that she told us about, and it was called Avastin. And this drug was developed for cancer patients, but it had proved to work on one other patient with a similar case to mine. So we decided to go ahead with this experimental drug. And I stayed at the hospital for the first few injections because they expected me to feel worse before I started feeling better. And that was definitely the case. And so when I returned to London, I stayed with my parents for a few weeks, and I was able to continue receiving doses of this drug in my hometown. And I got back on my feet, and I was slowly able to walk again, and I gained back some strength.
So you were starting to feel better and gain back your strength. Were you able to return to work at this point?
I had many injections of this drug before I was feeling well enough to work. A year had passed before I went back to work, but I was often throwing up in the morning before I went to the salon, and I had headaches and I had depression because I knew at some point in my life I would face more health challenges, and I stayed on this drug for 4 years.
So if the drug was working, why did you stop taking it after the 4 years?
Near the end of 2014, the abdominal pain returned and it was worse. And this time, it went on for months before I actually began bleeding internally, and I was passing blood and fluid began to accumulate on my stomach. I was having blood transfusions and multiple night stays every month at the hospital since the year had began. And right around the same time, my mom started to feel sick too. Unfortunately, she had complications from her first transplant and started to manifest. So Mom and I were put on the transplant list in May of 2015. And so I needed to be off of this experimental drug to have the transplant.
Did you consider having a live donor at any point?
We did. We did an extensive search to find a live donor, and I had many friends and a family member tested to see if they were a suitable match for me, but we had no luck.
And what kind of symptoms were you experiencing at this time?
I believe the worst symptom was the ascites, the fluid that was accumulating on my stomach. It made me nauseous, and I couldn't eat, and it was increasingly painful and uncomfortable. And I would get this fluid drained every week or so through a process called Paracentesis. And this was a painful process too. I was skin and bones, and it was hard to lay on a hospital bed for hours while the fluid drained. And I remember one day I was to have this procedure done, and they hooked me up to this vacuum type thing. It was a different way of relieving the fluid, and it relieved 13 liters of fluid from my stomach. And you'd think that getting rid of this would be helpful, but somehow it made matters a lot worse, and my electrolytes were now out of whack, which put me at risk for seizures, and my water and salt intake needed to be monitored very closely.
So what was it like for you, having both you and your mom on the waiting list at the same time? What was that experience like?
Crazy. Mom was there for me as best as she could be. And because she had already been through the process, it was oddly comforting that she was there and someone I could talk to about the different aspects of liver failure that I was experiencing.
And when did you and your mom end up having your transplants?
So let's fast forward to February 19th of 2016. And I was in the hospital, and Mom was in the hospital visiting me. And we were sitting on the bed, and in walked our transplant coordinator. And she joined our conversation for like 10 to 15 minutes. It seemed like a long time before she paused, and she looked at Mom and I, and she said, "Bonnie, I'm actually here because I have some news for you." And I began to cry right away. I knew what she meant. And Mom was confused. And she said, "A liver has become available for you, and you're going to have your transplant tonight."
That must have been a pretty emotional moment.
Yes, the emotions were very heavy, and Mom was upset. She wanted me to have my transplant first, but I just looked at her and I said, "Mom, you have to do this. I still need you in my life, and I need you to be there for me when I have my transplant."
How did your mom's transplant go?
So I went with her that evening to the operating room, or to prep for the operating room, and it was quite something to be there for her in that time. And when she went into the OR, I simply went back up a few floors to my room to continue to wait for my turn. So the next morning, it was a positive update. Mom had her second successful liver transplant, and it went really well. However, she was still under anesthesia, and they felt it was necessary to keep her sedated for reasons that I don't remember at this time.
So at this point, your mom is recovering from her second liver transplant. How much longer did you have to wait to receive yours?
It was 2 weeks between our transplants. The morning of March 3rd, a doctor came into my room at 6:30 a.m. and I remember thinking that was odd. And I learned in this moment that for each harvested organ, there needs to be a backup patient to receive the transplant, so not to waste a viable organ. And that was me. I was the backup patient. So in this case, they prepare you as if you're going to have the transplant. And so I went through the series of tests to ensure I was in shape to have the surgery. I was trying not to get my hopes up because I couldn't handle another letdown. And I waited all day, and 8:30 p.m. came and a hepatologist came into my room. And when the words left his lips, "We need you in the OR in 30 minutes. You're going to have a transplant tonight," I shrieked with joy that I had never felt in my life. And of course, I wanted to tell my mom. So Zach arrived at the hospital, and my nurse and Zach put me in a wheelchair, and we went down to the 4th floor where my mom was recovering from her transplant to tell her the news. And we approached her. She was sitting up in bed, and she looked confused, like, "What are you doing here? Why are you here so late?" And when I told her I was going to have my transplant, she absolutely freaked out. And we were just both so excited. And there was no fear because we knew that I was going to be in a better place after this, no matter what happened.
What else do you remember about this moment?
I was put on a bed and wheeled into a very white and clean room. And the last few people that I remember talking to me were the anesthesiologists, and they were very kind, and they assured me that I wouldn't feel anything. And the next thing I remember is waking up in the ICU. There were tubes and things all over the place. I was hooked up to more machines than I had ever seen. And I just remember feeling so grateful to be alive and to see my mom and my dad, my sister and Zach, and my surgeon. They were all there with me.
What was it like to be so close to death one day and absolutely alive the next?
I recall feeling like my life had spun a 180, overnight, which it basically had, not just physically, but mentally. I wasn't the sick person anymore. And for so long, I wasn't able to do anything. And my mind began to wander into the opportunities that I could finally say yes to.
And what was the first thing you wanted to do after your transplant?
I was so determined to become strong and healthy again, and to be able to move. I, for so long, was unable to do that. So that's all I could think about was gaining back my strength. So a hospital volunteer came into my room, my hospital room where I was recovering, and he handed me a brochure. And this brochure was advertising the World Transplant Games, and they were to take place the following year, 2017, in Malaga, Spain. And it was then and there that I decided that I wanted to go. It was over a year away, and at that moment, I literally envisioned myself standing on the podium representing Canada. This was something that I wanted to work towards. And I saw that swimming was a sport at the World Games. So once I was out of the hospital, I dreamt that I could return to the pool. I I swam a lot as a kid, and in hindsight, I wish that I had kept swimming throughout my teenage years. So this was an opportunity to get back to the water.
What else can you tell us about your recovery?
I struggled with my mental health a bit at first. I had been on antidepressants for years before my transplant, and I was off of them now. So that was an adjustment. And I was on prednisone for about 6 months as well, and that played with my emotions. But by May, about 3 months after my transplant, I found great comfort in getting into routine, going to the gym and going to the pool, because I wanted to work towards my goal of competing in Spain at the Transplant Games. So I honestly found that the water was a huge part of my physical and my mental recovery. I found it meditative. It helped me regain my strength and my confidence. And about 6 months after my transplant, I returned to work, which again, in hindsight, was probably a little bit too soon.
So at this point, you're training for the World Transplant Games. What came of that?
So August of 2017, Zach and I traveled to Spain, and I could write a whole speech on my experience at the Transplant Games. But since we're getting close to running out of time, I'll just let you know that it was absolutely a life-changing experience. To be at a sporting event with literally thousands of other grateful transplant recipients was an experience that I hope to have again and again. So at the games, I swam in the 200-meter freestyle and 400-meter freestyle events, and I swam faster than I ever had in my life. I won 2 silver medals in those events, and I cried tears of joy on the podium.
So you've become an international transplant athlete. Can you tell us a little bit about the next games you competed in?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to compete at the Canadian Transplant Games in Vancouver in 2018. And I worked hard all year at swimming, and I won 5 gold medals at the Canadian Transplant Games. I won 4 in the pool and 1 in the 5K road race. And this trip was really special because my parents were there and Zach was there, and Mom also competed in the 5K road race and she won a bronze medal. So the next World Games were in 2019 were in Newcastle, England. And I had been training with my master swim team and progressively becoming a better swimmer and a faster swimmer. And this showed true at these games in Newcastle. I won 5 gold. I set 5 world records in my age group, and I became the fastest female transplant swimmer.
You've also been very involved in the transplant community, promoting organ donation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, my transplant has literally given my life back, and I wouldn't be here without my donor or my support network. So to give back, I've been involved in organ donation awareness events like the local Transplant Trot. It's a 5K run and 3K walk here in London. I've helped a friend with a fundraising event called Night of Rock and Blues. And each year I relay swim 30 kilometers across Lake Muskoka with a group of 5 other swimmers. And the aim for that event is to urge our Ontario government to become an opt-out system instead of our current system where we have to opt in to become an organ donor.
So the 2021 Transplant Games have been canceled. So what are you currently training for?
Most recently, I've started a foundation with my transplant friends, and we've called it the Move for Life Foundation. And we plan to have a different event each year where we promote active living and perform some kind of physical challenge. So this year, the funds that we raise are going to support the London Health Sciences Centre to purchase new technology that will help reduce the wait list for an organ transplant. So the first challenge will happen this summer, and I've been training for well over a year to attempt to do a solo swim 52 kilometers across Lake Ontario in August.
Very cool. Last question, Jillian. Do you have any last words, and where can the viewers find you?
Every day I think of my liver donor. I think about the people who register to become an organ donor, and I truly believe that they are heroes, because even for the moment they decide to register to donate life in some form, they realize they won't be here forever, but that they have something to give to help someone else. So today I count in the years which I am so fortunate to be here and be alive, and I am more alive than ever. And it's like I've grabbed onto life with my bare hands, and I examine and admire its beauty every day. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your time. You can follow my journey on Facebook at Move for Life, and you can also check our website out, www.moveforlifefoundation.com.